I think my first experience was in I was going to say 65, but maybe it doesn't go that far back. When I went with, I was asked by Council, I was going to Saudi Arabia. No, somebody else at that time. Because I was going to Jeddah to look up a certain prince in Jeddah who was there, I guess their associate or something. And of course, being new to the whole thing, I went into the hotel, the Red Sea Palace. That was the only hotel in town at that time. And met this prince and had a long talk. I guess divulged all sorts of information about the project. And then I found out that it was the wrong prince. And Council was absolutely furious. So that was my first faux pas.
Okay.
But later, I was always interested in the area, and I traveled a lot in different parts of the Middle East. And an Irishman who was the consultant to the planning department of Kuwait got in touch with me and said, look, we're doing a new university, and I think Simon Fraser is a unique university, and this must have been about, I think it's about 67 or so. And would you come and would you bid on it? So I got in touch with Council, the same person, I can't remember his name, and we went to Kuwait and we spent about a week working out a proposal and turned it in. And there was a very nice young man working for this Irishman who was also in the planning department, and we thought, it was absolutely sewn up, and whatever year it was the year of the invasion of, no, it had to do with, I think, it had to do with Egypt. It was, maybe it was 73.
Yeah.
And the only country that, of sort of the Western countries who had sided with sort of the Arab side was Spain at the time. I think others did later, but Spain was number one at that time. So it was a sudden decision to give it to the Spanish, to give this commission.
Yes.
The Spanish government was worried. So we lost that. And then I kept going to Saudi Arabia, and there were a lot of projects that we did, in, I guess one of the earliest was the Academy, the Air Force Academy.
I see.
And I can't even remember how we got that commission. We did a number of projects. For instance, there was a certain imam from Medina who had some housing that he wanted to do, and we did a project for that. I guess we were traveling back and forth. We didn't have an office until we started. We had an office in Jeddah, I guess, about maybe it was 73, 74, 75, somewhere in there. And we had one for 3 years. And that was really through the initiative of my Vancouver office, who we got External Affairs in Canada. We heard about the new Ministry of External Affairs that was supposed to go up. So we got External Affairs in Canada to help us send over people and that sort of thing to advise the Saudis on what kind of building they should have. And as a result of that, we did the program for the ministry. But then the ministry felt it had to go out to international competition because diplomatically they were obliged to appease all the different countries. And, you know, we didn't foresee that. We thought we could ease into the project more easily. And then, but they told us that we would be one of the competitors. And there was an objection from the different ambassadors to that, because we obviously knew more about their requirements than anybody else. And so they came up with the idea that they give us a handicap. They give everybody else 6 months more to do the project than we had. And then there was so much objection from the various ambassadors that they finally said, well, we really can't let you compete, because this really has to be everyone else. However, we'll hire you to be our personal consultant to supervise the design and the construction of the whole building. So at that time we set up an office. Well, before the program we set up an office, but we could continue with our office in Jeddah. And that lasted 3-4 years. And then at the same time, also the Vancouver office got involved with some projects in Kuwait. The Irishman was still there.
Yes.
And we became quite friendly with the head of planning in Kuwait, and that's when we were involved in the new Center for FinTech. And some of these projects, generally the Saudis were going to what was his name? Gunman. He was a rather eminent architect and historian from Connecticut,
I see,
who had a team, and they would set up a limited competition for architects. And that's how we also won the competition to do the project in Iraq, which was so we've had this long relationship. This business of referring to something that is not within the compass of your senses.
Yes.
Such as referring to the orientation of the stadium, which is about 2 kilometers away, using that as the grid to his building, which no one, unless they were flying over, might see a similarity. You know, it's to me utter nonsense. It was Paramount Paramount Films who was doing it, and they called our office. And actually, I had a friend who was a friend of the director. I had a friend in Hollywood. She's a producer, and she had told the director that when he goes up to Vancouver to see the museum, he decided that's what he wanted to use in the film. And so I was delighted. I knew Richard Gere previously.
I see.
When we had our office down. And so it was fun for me to coach him on what to say about the building and that sort of thing. Although I don't think he paid any attention. Certainly Simon Fraser has been in about 3 or 4. The courthouse has been in 3 or 4.
Okay,
the San Diego was in the last Sylvester Stallone film. What was it? I don't know. It was Terminator or Predator, and the California was in Rising Sun. It was the headquarters for Rising Sun. And now there's a Disney film that takes place in our Fresno City Hall.
Is that
so? I think I'm maybe a better set designer than an architect. Well, yes, I had always been an admirer of his, and of course I visited much of his work.
Yes.
But I had the opportunity when I was still at university, just before the last year at McGill, to go to Taliesin, and that's when I met him.
Yes.
And of course, at that time, he was known as a kind of ogre. And so I was very apprehensive about going going to meet him, but however, I found him to be absolutely delightful. He absolutely countered all the myths. But, you know, I think so many of the best things being done are being done by engineers, not architects.
Yes,
I think its surreal aspects are interesting.
Yes.
The exaggerated perspective, the shrinking stairways and things like that. It's sort of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. There's a lot of things happening in architecture that have to do, I think, with dreams.
Yes.
And nightmares.
Yes.
Things like that. Well, no, I think, I'm still very much a modernist. I believe that one should derive something as much from the program and from the site, history, but not in a historical way. Culture, but not so much an historical way. You want to go to the sources of these things rather than, because postmodernism is not that different from Disneyland. And I think what is happening today is I think the awful thing in America is the Disneyfication. The important thing there was that Washington has a very definite context.
Yes.
And what I was trying to avoid was to comply with that context, but not use anything that was really classical.
I see.
In other words, not use Corinthian or Ionic columns or something like that. Maybe use columns, but with a twist.
I see. Yeah.
For instance, the colonnade, the rotunda, but the rotunda has one column missing, so it's not complete. Just because I didn't want it to be a complete rotunda. And also the other thing is that the huge columns
yes
support nothing. And so it's a kind of saying, all right, colonnade, I'll put it in, but it's hollow. The columns are hollow aluminum. And it's a kind of symbol to give scale to the court.
Yes.
As much as that is. So I had fun with that building because it was the first time that I'd worked with one of the ideas of classical orders is that you can change the scale of a building because you're using a device such as a column that you use in miniature, you use in grand, you use in heroic proportions, and you can adjust the impact through the use of things. Unless if a person is coming in with their own baggage, with their own style, into different parts of the country and the world and different climates and things like that, it doesn't work.
Yes.
And right away we said, in the West you have to have as much light in that rainy climate as you can. And you can't use dark colors in dark places. This business putting dark green at the base of the building. I had a long talk with Prince Charles.
That's right.
For a whole day I was with him when he was out in Vancouver. And this is before he'd come up with any of his attitudes about architecture. And he said, I'm very interested in architecture. I want to know more about it. And I was trying to give him books to read, except that I don't think anyone writes well about architecture. I don't think you can write about architecture. You have to see it. And Prince Charles then reverted to this Regency thing, but he can't help it. His home is Regency. Everything about his life is Regency.
Very much.
That's all he feels comfortable with. He doesn't understand, although he should, because he's a very intelligent and very bright person. He's a remarkably bright person. I don't think anyone in any royal family in Europe has been as intelligent and bright as Prince Charles. I think he's an extraordinary leader. but he'd be controversial. And I think he would listen if the right people got to him about what he's doing. But I think you have to look at what's behind what he's doing rather than at it. I mean, this sort of whole revival of Regency, Greek revival, and that sort of thing, which is Prior's input. It's very romantic. It's another Disneyland.
Yes.
I'm sad that, unfortunately, it was not reported correctly. I would like to have taken lawsuits against the newspapers. It was the fact that here, we just didn't. It was during the beginning of the recession.
Yes.
And we were certainly working or living very much on the edge. We always had.
Yes. You had the 4 offices too, like
3 offices.
3?
Yeah. And we were never sort of being able to get ahead enough or have a large enough project that was long enough to really sustain a big office, except some of the Saudi projects. They were the only ones.
Yes.
They dried out completely. All the Middle East projects went, and that affected the Toronto office more than anything. The Eddie Salat in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and all those projects. And then after this office comes in Los Angeles, the same thing began to happen. It was the financial crunch.
Yes.
And I saw it coming, and I went to a couple of different offices who were very interested, Eastern offices, who were very interested in perhaps associating. And that would have pulled us out of the fire. But one of them was Leo Daly. And we had only enough to carry on for about 3 months. And Leo Daly had really promised that everything was going to be fine. He was, we were going to organize it and that sort of thing. And then he phoned me and he said, Arthur, I've just been at the White House. And he said, I had an exposure of what was going to happen in the United States. And I can't afford to do anything. I've just got to withdraw all of our energies and keeping this one off. He said, there's going to be a very serious recession. And this is before there were many signs of it, except we were already feeling it, as our sense too. And so that was the writing on the wall. What I'm doing, I'm associating as an individual designer with different offices. And in Vancouver, I'm associating with 2 offices. One is a big commercial office, and the other is a small atelier which have some of most of my people. And the big commercial office has the other half of my original Vancouver office. The Vancouver office really never closed, but it was just decided it would be better to reorganize that way. And then in the States, I'm with Gruen on a couple of projects.
Yes. Okay.
Not actual design competition, but we have done a couple in Taiwan.
Oh, I see.
And Vietnam, Malaysia. We've done a lot of quite interesting work recently. He's got, I haven't seen the last one. I've always felt that you've got to have a site, And for instance, Markham is a very good example because it was the crossroads of 2 major highways.
Yes.
And so you have to create a place. And the only reasonable thing there was to do it with landscape. Dig out mound against the highway, put in water, and that sort of thing. I've always used terrain and water, and maybe that's a Vancouver thing because water reflects the sky, and it gets, especially a gray sky.
Yes.
You get a gray gray water, which at least is light instead of very dark earth, you know, with no light. And so water on the ground is important in gray weather. But you know, I've been criticized by, you know, whether is it a building or is it a park and that sort of thing. You know? I mean, it's again, you go through a gate in a very, very run-down neighborhood, and,
I see.
and there's this marvelous. It's in Point Grey. Teaching, and you know, I've never had time to tend to the garden. I mean, the reason the garden is the way it is because I never had time to tend to it. You know? No, I didn't want to be an architect. I wanted to be a painter.
Okay.
And so I started off, but then my father said, "Look, you know, you'll never make a living with painting." I think I would have made a much better living with painting than I did with architecture.
Okay.
And then he said, "Why don't you try something like architecture?" And then when I was about 16 or 17, I guess, I met Richard Neutry. He was staying with friends of mine in Vancouver. And I asked him, and I said, you know, I'm a painter, and my father suggests I go into architecture, and, you know, how is there a place where you can be trained as an architect, where the emphasis is on the art side of it? And he said, you know, what I would suggest to you is that you go to MIT and finish a course in engineering before doing anything else. So I just dismissed architecture entirely. I thought, you know, I'm not going to go to any engineering school. That's the hardest thing from my mind. And not realizing at that time that engineering could be, you know, a great art in the right hands. California Plaza. That was 80, 81.
Yeah, okay.
81. I'm concerned about the computer, virtual reality, all of those things. You know, there's a kind of. I think the problem is that the public for architecture is becoming less and less educated. I really question the logic of what it is because, again, I always go back to very, very ancient prototypes. And the port has always been the generator of cities. You know, seaport, crossroads, the trade center. It's always been the generator of cities. And the airport should be in the same way.
Yes.
But it's sort of relegated outside of the city, and people are completely transited. Whereas I think the airport could be more of a generator of the center. I think it's an art in which your success is based on your perception of what really matters today, and not what is fashion, what is stylish or anything else, but how whatever you're doing has a different meaning than it had before. And because what you're doing, you're housing something that must be housed properly. But too often, what architects do is put a pretty dress on, and they're not real tailors. They don't take the proper measurements. They don't understand how the garment really must enhance the person.
Yes.
And also, I think the most important thing, which of course I've always agreed with, is that the building is the marriage between what is outside and what is inside. And architects are becoming much more sensitive to the environment, to the site, and that sort of thing. Because for me, that's where much of my inspiration comes from. And it always has.
No,
I only met him. And then I was glad I didn't work. Well, because he was a tyrant, and I told many young people that used to talk to me and went to Rice and stayed at Tellys, and I said, you must promise me that you will only stay a year, because anyone that stayed longer than a year has really become just a vassal to Wright and Mrs. Wright.
Yeah.
I was the designer.
I see.
I mean, it's pretty difficult. I think there's a lot of confusion, you know.
Yeah.
Direction isn't clear. I think there's some very talented people. There's no question about that. Well, it's unfortunately, I thought at least it was beginning to be a kind of legitimate style, but it's too suddenly become a style. And it's almost impossible to differentiate one deconstructivist from another, you know. It's very much a way of composing and that sort of thing. I think its origin is and why I think it's legitimate is the space stuff. Because of the lack of gravity. And all deconstructivism has these very thin things sort of reaching out that are unsupported. And you don't know how they stay up. And I don't know how many are built and whether they do stay up. You know. But I think that's the whole impulse to have these floating. That's the aesthetic of today, I think, is that floating aspect. I think he has a point, and that is it's almost as if it were something built out of the actual rock.
I see. Just for the roof lines are too many things in there.
No, exactly.
Yeah, and
it doesn't work. The spaces inside. I've been several times in Egypt, and the reason I was interested in Al-Azhar was that I had done a history thesis on the university, and that's always quoted as the first university in the world.
That's Al-Azhar.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I visited from that point of view, and I've always used it. As a matter of fact, it's been an inspiration for instance, you wouldn't believe it, but the university at Lethbridge, which has this mall inside where classes are occurring quite casually on banquettes and things like that. Well, that was inspired by Al-Azhar, because the whole idea that you could be walking by somebody and hear somebody discussing something and suddenly become interested. And that's what education should be. You should suddenly be inspired to do something. Work in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, okay.
And two buildings at Simon Fraser University, and the new library at UBC, University of British Columbia,